Welcome back to Crime Time, Inc., and today we are reviewing the second of 4 Reith lectures from the BBC by forensic psychiatrist Dr. Gwen Adshead.
This lecture is titled, "But Aren't They All Evil?"
Oh, interesting.
And it was delivered at the V&A Museum in Dundee, Scotland.
In Scotland?
Yeah. It's pretty interesting that it was given in Scotland, considering they have their own laws around crime and punishment, separate from the rest of the UK.
And we know Dr. Adshead has worked with people who've committed violent crimes her entire career.
Yeah.
So she's really tackling this question of evil head on in this one.
You bet. She starts by addressing that common perception that people who commit violent acts are just straight up evil.
Yeah.
But she doesn't stop there. She argues that everyone has the capacity for evil, even if they never act on it.
Whoa.
Yeah.
That's a pretty heavy statement. I'm curious how she backs that up.
Well, she draws a lot from her experience with patients in secure psychiatric hospitals and prisons. She says that when she first meets someone who has committed a horrific act, she's often struck by how ordinary they seem.
You know, it makes me think of that idea of the banality of evil. You know, how some of the most horrific acts are carried out by seemingly regular people.
That's exactly what Dr. Adshead is getting at. She talks about how, as these individuals share their stories, she sees a series of events and choices that led them to the point of committing the crime. It really makes you think about how anyone, given certain circumstances, might be capable of violence.
So it's not as simple as saying someone is just born bad.
No, it's way more complicated than that. Dr. Adshead says that while her patients' actions are extraordinary, the individuals themselves, on the surface, often aren't. She even compares them to natural disasters. One patient even referred to himself as a tornado in the path of his victim.
Wow, that's a powerful image.
It is.
So what's the danger in just labeling someone as evil then?
Well, she argues that attributing violence solely to evil is a way for us to distance ourselves from the unsettling reality that ordinary people are capable of horrific acts. It's easier to just write someone off as evil than to actually wrestle with the complexities of their actions.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. It's kind of like when you hear about a horrific crime. And you think, oh, well, that person must just be a monster. It's a way to protect ourselves from facing the possibility that something similar could happen closer to home.
Exactly. She references the historian Christopher Browning, who wrote a book called Ordinary Men, about a battalion of German soldiers who participated in the mass killing of Jews during World War II.
I think I read about that. Didn't Browning find that most of those soldiers weren't really driven by ideology?
You got it. He found that many of them were seemingly average guys who were just following orders. It's a scary example of how powerful situational factors and social pressure can be.
It really makes you think about how obedience to authority and going along with the crowd can lead to some pretty terrible things.
Absolutely. Dr. Adshead then shifts to what makes up an evil state of mind.
So what are the ingredients for this evil state of mind?
She proposes 7 key components, but we can focus on a few of the most relevant ones for us. First, she talks about cognitive distortions, which are basically ways of thinking that lead to rigid and inflexible views of the world and other people.
Can you give me an example of that?
Sure. Let's say someone has this distorted belief that they can automatically know what another person is thinking or feeling. Or they see the world in black and white terms, like winners and losers, with no room for gray areas. You see this in a lot of cult leaders, for example.
I'm starting to see how that could be a problem.
And then the second component is hyper-individualism. It's like their ego is inflated and they lack empathy and see others as insignificant, especially in their own moral calculations.
So they don't see other people as fully human.
Exactly. And that feeds into the third component, which is an absolute sense of entitlement to power and control over others.
I can see how that combination would be dangerous.
Oh, definitely. Think about those abusers who feel they have the right to dictate everything their victims do, even what they think.
So we have a distorted worldview, a lack of empathy, and a sense of entitlement. What's next on Dr. Adshead's list?
The fourth component she mentions is about having a personal moral code that throws societal norms out the window. Basically, they create their own rules, rules that justify their harmful actions and totally disregard the well-being of others.
It's almost like they think they're above the law.
That's a good way to put it. To illustrate this,
Okay.
Dr. Adshead mentions a story from Primo Levi's account of being in Auschwitz. Levi saw a guard beating a prisoner who dared to ask why he was being treated so cruelly. The guard simply replied, "There is no why here."
Wow, that's disturbing.
Yeah.
It shows a complete lack of regard for any kind of established morality.
Exactly. And this feeds into the next component, which is dehumanizing the victims.
Right.
This makes it easier to justify causing them harm.
We've seen this happen throughout history, right?
Yes.
Like during genocides.
Yes.
When propaganda portrays entire groups of people as less than human.
You're absolutely right. But Dr. Adshead also points out that sometimes it's not so black and white.
Right.
In some cases, perpetrators might actually want to preserve their victims' humanity in their minds.
Why would they do that?
It's twisted.
It seems counterintuitive.
But sometimes they want their victims to fully understand and feel the pain they're inflicting. It's about control and punishment.
That's really scary to think about.
It is.
Yeah.
And finally, perhaps the sneakiest element in all of this is self-deception. This is where the perpetrator convinces themselves that their actions are justifiable, maybe even righteous. It's like they create this alternate reality where they're not the bad guy.
So they're basically lying to themselves to avoid guilt.
That's a big part of it.
Yeah.
They might tell themselves they're doing a good deed.
Right.
Or acting in the service of some greater purpose.
Right.
They might convince themselves that their victims deserved it. It's all about shielding themselves from the truth of their actions.
I see how this self-deception makes all the other components of an evil state of mind even more possible.
Yes.
But what leads someone to develop this kind of mindset in the first place? Where does it all begin?
Well, that's where the lecture gets really interesting.
Okay.
Dr. Adshead shifts gears and starts talking about the role of emotions.
Right.
Specifically, the 7 deadly sins.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
She argues that these emotions are pride, gluttony, lust, greed, envy, sloth, and anger, when they're not kept in check and allowed to fester, can actually set the stage for developing an evil state of mind.
So it's not just about making bad choices. There's a deeper emotional component at play.
Right. And she also brings in the social and cultural context.
Okay.
Remember, we're social creatures.
Right.
And we're influenced by the stories and beliefs that circulate in our communities.
Yeah.
When those narratives promote things like greed,
right.
hatred, and dehumanization, it becomes easier for people to slip into that evil state of mind.
So it's like a vicious cycle, individual tendencies and societal influences feeding off each other.
Exactly. But Dr. Adshead also offers a glimmer of hope.
Okay.
She suggests that cultivating compassion and gratitude can be a powerful antidote to these negative forces.
So it's not enough to just say evil is bad.
Right.
We have to actively cultivate good.
That's her main message, that we all have a responsibility to challenge those harmful narratives that divide us, and to nurture compassion in ourselves and others.
I'm starting to see how these ideas about evil connect to real-world crimes.
Yes.
But I'm also curious about how this lecture landed with the audience.
Yeah.
I know there was a Q&A, right?
Yes, and it gets very real.
Okay.
The first person to speak is Linda McDonald, who shares her story of being attacked by a parolee.
Wow, that must have taken a lot of courage.
It did. Her story really brings home the consequences of encountering someone in that evil state of mind that Dr. Adshead described.
I imagine that was a powerful moment for everyone in the room.
Yeah.
Especially for Dr. Adshead.
Yes.
Knowing that these aren't just abstract concepts she's talking about.
You're right. It grounds the discussion in reality.
Yep.
And then a former police officer named Simon McLean challenges Dr. Adshead. He asks if some people are just born bad, plain and simple.
You think he's encountered his fair share of people who seem that way over the years?
I'm sure he has. He expresses a belief that a lot of people share, which is that some individuals are just wired differently.
Right.
And there's no changing them.
Right.
It brings up that classic debate of nature versus nurture.
Is it something inherent in them, or is it a result of their environment and experiences?
Exactly.
Okay.
Dr. Adshead acknowledges that while she believes in the possibility of rehabilitation for some, there are cases where it might not be realistic.
So she's not saying everyone can be saved?
No, not at all. She's very pragmatic about that.
Okay.
But she emphasizes that understanding the factors that contribute to violence, including that desire to harm, is crucial.
Right.
Even if it doesn't lead to rehabilitation.
Right.
It can help us prevent violence in the future.
So even if we can't change someone's core nature,
yes,
understanding where their behavior comes from can still be valuable.
Absolutely. It might help us identify early warning signs or develop strategies to manage the risk.
It sounds like this is a really nuanced conversation.
It is.
She's balancing the idea of individual responsibility with the potential for rehabilitation.
You're picking up on that perfectly.
Yeah.
Then another audience member, Professor Naam Nikdade, brings up the nature versus nurture debate directly. She asks for Dr. Adshead's take on whether we are born evil or shaped by our upbringing.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is, and Dr. Adshead basically says it's a false dichotomy. Framing it as nature or our nurture is pointless. Because our nature is always being molded by our environment.
So it's not either, it's both.
She emphasizes that we're heavily shaped by our social interactions. And while our personalities have some stable elements, they're also capable of change.
So even people who've done awful things,
yes,
they're not necessarily stuck in that state forever.
That's the hope. It leaves room for the possibility of growth.
Okay, so nature and nurture both play a role.
Yes.
But what about the environments that breed violence? What about societal factors?
Well, Jimmy Paul, who leads the Violence Reduction Unit in Scotland, brings up the public health approach to violence.
I've heard about that. It's about treating violence like a disease that can be prevented, right?
Exactly. He's talking about addressing the root causes of violence, things like poverty, lack of opportunity, and substance abuse. And Dr. Adshead agrees that this approach is super important.
So it's about more than just focusing on the individual offender. It's about creating environments where violence is less likely to occur.
It's a more holistic way of looking at the problem.
I'm with you so far, but wouldn't that take away individual responsibility? Like, if someone grew up in a bad environment, are we saying they're not responsible for their choices?
That's a great point. And it's something Dr. Adshead addresses. While she supports the public health approach, she also cautions against completely dismissing individual agency and choice.
So it's a balancing act. Recognizing the influence of external factors, but still holding individuals accountable for their actions.
Precisely.
This is getting complicated. But I appreciate how Dr. Adshead is acknowledging all these different perspectives.
She's great at that. And then another former Reith lecturer, Darren McGarvey, chimes in with a question about the role of self-justification in violence.
I think about that a lot.
Yeah.
How can people commit horrific acts and still sleep at night? How do they rationalize that in their minds?
That's exactly what Darren's getting at. He wonders if the perpetrators Dr. Adshead works with might be clinging to these distorted narratives to justify their violence.
So they're creating a version of reality where their actions make sense. Even if it's completely messed up.
And Dr. Adshead agrees, saying it's rare for someone to admit they set out to do something evil. Instead, they come up with stories that downplay their actions or make their victims seem less important.
It's like they're protecting their egos from the reality of what they've done.
Exactly. They might say things like, my victims didn't matter, or nobody cares what I did. It's a chilling glimpse into how people can switch off their moral compasses.
It's scary.
Yes.
But it also makes sense. But is that all it is? Just self-justification? Or can violence become almost like an addiction?
Well, that's another thing Darren asks. He wonders if there's a sort of tolerance that builds up where someone needs to commit increasingly violent acts to get the same sense of satisfaction.
Now that's a disturbing thought. I guess we've seen addictive patterns with other harmful behaviors.
And while Dr. Adshead says more research is needed, she does point out that escalating patterns of violence are a major red flag.
So if someone starts with petty theft and then moves on to assault, that could be a sign that things are heading in a bad direction.
Exactly. She stresses that it's crucial to recognize those patterns early and intervene before the violence escalates further.
It makes me think that early intervention could be key here, along with addressing those root causes that we talked about earlier.
I think you're right. If we can interrupt that cycle of escalation, it could make a huge difference.
So we've talked about individual factors, societal influences, and emotional roots. What about education? Can we teach people to be less violent?
That's a great question. And one that Pam Galag, a member of parliament, she specifically asks if anti-violence programs in schools could be effective.
It seems like it would make sense to start early.
Yes.
But can you really teach kids to be less violent?
Well,
or are those tendencies already baked in?
Dr. Adshead believes that education,
Okay.
especially emotional education, is super important. She argues that schools should be teaching kids how to deal with difficult emotions and handle conflict constructively.
So it's not just about saying violence is wrong.
Right.
It's about giving them the tools to deal with anger, frustration, and disagreements in a healthy way.
Exactly. It's about building emotional intelligence and encouraging pro-social behavior.
I imagine that would involve teaching things like empathy, communication skills, and conflict resolution.
You got it.
Yeah.
And it would also mean challenging those harmful narratives that can contribute to violence. It's about creating a culture of respect and understanding.
I can see how that would be a big undertaking.
Yeah.
But it feels essential if we want to break the cycle of violence.
I agree.
Yeah.
And then Anita Anand, the host of the lecture, picks up on the age of rage idea that's been floating around. She asks Dr. Adshead if she thinks society is getting angrier.
That's a fascinating question.
It is.
Are we more prone to anger now than in the past?
Dr. Adshead wonders if maybe every age experiences rage. But it just manifests in different ways.
Right.
She points out a trend she's seeing, though, which is a sense of entitlement that often comes along with anger these days. People feel like they have the right to say and do whatever they want, regardless of how it affects others.
So it's not just about feeling angry. It's about feeling justified in acting on that anger in harmful ways.
That's right. And she connects this to a lack of accountability. People are less willing to take responsibility for the harm they cause, whether it's with their words or actions.
I can definitely see that happening.
Yeah.
Especially online. People can say really cruel things behind the safety of their screens.
Absolutely. Social media can be a breeding ground for unchecked rage and aggression. And then Anita Anand asks about the gendered aspects of anger and violence, pointing out that men commit the vast majority of homicides.
That's a tough statistic to ignore.
It is.
Does Dr. Adshead think men are just more prone to rage?
No, not at all. She argues that women experience rage just as intensely as men, but they often express it differently.
So instead of outward aggression, women might internalize their rage and harm themselves.
That's one possibility. She notes the high rates of self-harm among women in prison. It suggests that they're dealing with immense anger and frustration, but they're lacking healthy outlets for those emotions.
It's a reminder that violence can take many forms.
Exactly. And she also points out that women's rage can sometimes be directed toward children, which brings up the whole complicated issue of maternal anger.
That's a really sensitive topic.
It is.
But important to address.
I agree. And then Professor Lindsay Thompson, a forensic psychiatrist at the University of Edinburgh, brings up the fact that the public health approach has actually been quite successful in Scotland. Homicide rates have gone down significantly.
That's encouraging. It shows that tackling the root causes of violence can really make a difference.
It does. And Dr. Adshead echoes that, saying that taking violence seriously and being proactive is way more effective than just labeling perpetrators as evil and locking them away.
So understanding the minds of perpetrators and developing interventions that address their needs and motivations is key.
That's what she's arguing for. It's about moving past these simplistic notions of good and evil. And really engaging with the complexity of human behavior.
I'm on board with that.
Yeah.
But I'm curious about what the victims of violence have to say about all this.
Well, that's where the next part of the Q&A gets really powerful. We hear from Mick North, whose 5-year-old daughter was killed in the Dundee school shooting back in 1996.
Oh, wow. That's heartbreaking.
It is.
I can't imagine the pain he's gone through.
It's unimaginable.
Yeah.
He talks about how the media immediately labeled the perpetrator as evil. But he rejects that label.
Why is that?
He sees it as a way to avoid addressing the factors that could have prevented the tragedy.
So instead of focusing on the individual's supposed evil, he wants people to look at the bigger picture. At the things that could have been done differently.
Exactly. He points out that the perpetrator was a man driven by a grudge, and that he had access to a gun. He believes that if those issues had been addressed, the shooting might never have happened.
It's a powerful message. He's not condoning the act.
No.
But he's challenging us to go deeper, to look for solutions.
You've got it. And Dr. Adshead is in complete agreement with him. She emphasizes the danger of just throwing around the label evil.
Right.
Because it shuts down analysis and prevents us from finding ways to prevent future tragedies.
It's a call to action, isn't it?
Yeah.
To move beyond simplistic labels.
Yes.
And really grapple with the complexities of violence.
Absolutely. It's about understanding, not excusing.
This has been a really insightful discussion.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm starting to understand the evil state of mind in a whole new light.
Me too. It's not about making excuses for horrific acts,
Right.
but about taking a deeper look at the factors that contribute to them,
Right.
both individual and societal.
It seems like the more we understand,
Yes.
the better equipped we'll be to prevent violence in the future.
That's the hope. But there's still so much more to unpack,
Okay.
especially when it comes to the role of religion in rehabilitation.
Okay, now I'm even more curious about what comes next in the Q&A. This is getting really interesting.
Well, hold on to your hats because it's about to get even more intense. A local councilwoman and psychotherapist named Nadia El Nakla raises the question of whether religion can actually help in rehabilitation.
That's interesting. I could see how faith could offer comfort and guidance for people wrestling with their past actions.
Yeah, right.
But I could also see it backfiring, making them feel even more guilty and hopeless.
Right. There's a fine line there. Dr. Adshead points out the important work that prison and hospital chaplains do.
Yeah.
Providing spiritual support and moral direction for people struggling with the weight of their crimes.
So it's not about forcing religion on them.
Right.
But about offering a framework for understanding morality and finding some kind of meaning.
Yeah.
After doing something so terrible.
Exactly. She emphasizes that for some people, faith can be a source of hope and a path toward making amends for their past.
That makes sense. Even people who have done awful things are still human.
Yes.
And might be looking for redemption.
Right. And then Anita Anand brings up a question.
Okay.
Dr. Adshead says she hears a lot from her patients. Am I evil?
Wow. I bet that's a tough one to answer, both for the patients asking
Yes.
and for Dr. Adshead,
Yeah.
trying to help them understand themselves and heal.
It is.
Yeah.
This leads to a conversation with Ann Stewart,
Right.
a prison chaplain who has worked with incarcerated individuals for 17 years.
I'm curious to hear her perspective. I wonder if she's encountered people who truly believe they're inherently evil.
She has.
Yeah.
And she shares a pretty simple but profound belief. Every human being is capable of both great good and great evil.
Okay.
She rejects the idea that anyone is completely and irredeemably evil.
So she sees that potential for both light and darkness in everyone.
Exactly. It's a message of compassion and understanding, recognizing that the human experience is messy and complicated.
That seems like a fitting way to end a lecture that delved into the dark side of human nature.
Yeah.
While also acknowledging our capacity for goodness.
I agree. It leaves us with a lot to think about.
It certainly does.
Yeah.
What stands out to you as the biggest takeaway from this lecture?
For me, it's the idea that understanding evil isn't about condoning it.
Yeah.
But about confronting it head on. It's about working toward a world where violence is less prevalent.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
It's not about ignoring the problem or simply writing people off as monsters. It's about digging deeper, understanding the root causes,
right,
and then finding ways to address those issues.
You got it. Yeah. It's a challenging task, but an important one.
And it sounds like it requires both individual effort and societal change.
Absolutely. We all have a role to play in building a more peaceful and just world.
I completely agree. And it seems like education, compassion, and a willingness to grapple with the complexities of human behavior are all crucial pieces of the puzzle.
Well said. It's an ongoing process that requires effort and commitment from all of us.
This discussion has really sparked a lot of thoughts for me. I'm particularly struck by Dr. Adshead's metaphor about the garden.
Yes.
You know, how both individual and social minds are like gardens that need tending.
It's such a powerful image. She's saying that if we neglect those gardens, the weeds of hatred, greed, and intolerance can take over and choke out the good stuff.
It makes me think about how important it is to be mindful of the thoughts we allow to take root in our own minds. And the narratives we choose to believe.
Right. And we also need to be active in tending to the gardens of our communities, working to create environments where compassion and justice can thrive.
It's a shared responsibility.
It is.
That requires continuous effort. It's not easy, but it's essential if we want to build a better future.
I couldn't agree more. And speaking of the future, Dr. Adshead's next lecture is going to be delivered from Grendon Prison in England.
Wow, that's a first for the Reith Lectures. I'm already intrigued. What's the focus of this next installment?
She'll be exploring the connection between childhood trauma and violence. Going into how early experiences can have a huge impact on our paths and our capacity for both harm and healing.
That's a topic that's both fascinating and heartbreaking. I'm definitely eager to hear what insights Dr. Adshead brings to that discussion.
Me too. It promises to be a thought-provoking and potentially transformative exploration of how our pasts and present are intertwined.
And as always, we'll be back next week to break down and discuss the third lecture in detail.
We'll unpack Dr. Adshead's arguments, analyze the evidence, and explore the implications of her insights for how we understand and prevent violence.
So be sure to join us next week as we continue our journey into this compelling series. Until then, stay curious and keep those gardens well tended.